Rachel, we have you here with us today to talk a little bit about your research. And from what I know, you were home educated yourself from the age of 11. You're based in Lancaster, and you have done some research that is connected to home education. Perhaps you could just give me a little bit more background about yourself, a bit of an introduction for those who are watching. If you need to open your slides now, you can as well. So we're basically here to discuss your research. It's about
Yeah,
how home educated people experience work and employment, which is quite an interesting topic. So perhaps you want to take over and tell me a little bit more about that and how you came to this.
yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me today. So, sorry, slides. So, yeah, my background really is that I was home educated, as Juliet said, since I was 11. And that kind of came about because I had been bullied through the school system and I'd always felt that I didn't fit in school. Other aspects was that where there was a skills gap, my dad felt that he could do better than what was happening in school. And so my dad was home educated himself for his last 2 years in high school. So he kind of already had that experience and thought, well, let's give this a go. And I was sort of at that age where I could have a say in what happened. So the way I would kind of describe it to people is that we did a more of an unschooled approach where it was quite flexible and we didn't really follow a curriculum. And that gave me a lot of freedom to just explore my interests. And I loved it. And then I guess when I got to kind of work and deciding what it is I wanted to do, everything just spiraled again like it did in school. So I worked in a few different roles. I think the first job I sort of had was in card factory. That was fine, easy going. It was when I moved into other roles, such as in marketing or HR, it was a completely different experience. And I started to have issues with things like authority with other colleagues and just, as the slides say, downright incompetence of other people. And it frustrated me because I didn't understand why I couldn't cope with some of these things that was happening. But at the same time, I would contest some of these things and it was never well received.
Yeah.
So I kind of knew I wanted to go into an academic pathway because the skills I got from home education, I felt would put me in a good position in this job because you could pursue something you were really interested in. You can use it to have a voice on issues like this. So when I started to think about a topic, it just felt very natural to put these two together. I was home educated. I had issues in work. Did other home educated
Yeah.
people experience this? So that's kind of where the project started.
Yeah.
So I guess I'll talk a little bit about the background to the PhD. So I wanted to kind of start by saying that I didn't impose a theory on the research because I was very much going into this wanting to get across the voices of people in this community because they're not heard or represented. So I went and did the field work and then came back and said kind of what explained what am I seeing in the data. So I kind of got to this point of people who are home educated could have this sense of a collective habitus. So yes, they have very different experiences of home education, but as a phenomenon, it brings them together with some shared practices and shared experiences that would shape their habitus differently, to use kind of like a budget term. Sorry, my French is not very good. So they have these experiences that overlap, much like if you've been to school, there is a common curriculum. Yes, you experience that differently. There is different types of school, but there is still some understanding of being within that community. Also within that is we have a field of education that commonly school is the main event that you go through at that age. But home education isn't seen as being on par with that. It's not normal to be home educated. So I would argue that home education can be seen as its own subfield in its own right. It's still part of the field of education, it's just different. But that also gives us opportunities to accrue capital, which is in a less monetary form we need in society. It's how we trade to get jobs and how we get new experiences and opportunities. But that might look different to people who are home educated. They don't necessarily have qualifications. Some do, some don't. Things like visiting museums, doing outdoor education, exploring through play, and just going out in nature and learning things all counts as capital, but isn't always seen by people in the mainstream as being capital.
Yeah,
So,
was being beneficial in any way.
yeah. So this was kind of where my thinking was at. But I also was seeing in the data this idea of haunting, and I didn't quite know how to capture that to begin with. But it seemed to be that the dispositions from the habitus of being home educated would trigger a response when they got to work. This could have been either negatively, as in, this is like school, I hate this, or it could have been positive in actually, this reminds me of being home educated. I want to go into work that's like that.
So is it that's an internal thing?
Yeah, so kind of like they used these memories to make sense or structure their current experiences.
Yeah.
And I will talk about that in a bit more detail in the findings. It was one of the main findings. So,
Yeah, it's very interesting because I've had 7 children, so who are all mainly adults, and there were certainly bits of your research that resonated with their experiences.
yeah, it's usually the case. It's interesting because at one point in time, I felt it was just me, and it's not. It's
Yeah,
shared
yeah,
across the community.
yeah.
So,
And I do want to actually say at this point that when I started, well, as I said, I didn't manage to read it all because it's quite a lot. But it did make me realize that my children, as they've got older, haven't necessarily stayed in touch with a lot of their home educated friends, and they probably need to. They probably
yeah,
they need to know that it's shared experience, and they're. But the thing I find as a home educator is that my children are so independent minded, and
yes.
that can be a strength, and it can be something that creates hurdles for you when you go
Yeah,
into the workplace.
it can be because it's not always received in the way it's
Yeah,
intended.
yeah, yeah,
And some people find it as a threat as well because
yeah,
they don't know how to do that for themselves.
yeah, that's true.
So just to kind of give background to the empirical side, it was qualitatively informed because of the focus on voices and getting that rich data about people's life history. So with the interviews, I went in with a very open dialogue of, please just tell me about your earliest memory of home education, of school, and kind of work through your trajectory till today in terms of your employment. And the longest, I think, was 3.5 hours.
Well,
And it's crazy. Because I had 31 participants as well. So having 3.5 hour interviews, it was time consuming, but well worth it
yeah,
because of the rich data.
up to 55.
Yeah, so my oldest participant was 55, the youngest was 18, and then everywhere in between.
Mm.
So I wanted to kind of reflect home education over time, but also to show how what one common challenge someone might say is, well, if they're like in their 40s or 50s, how relevant is home education? It happened decades ago. And so I really wanted to show that actually it matters, and it matters across a lifetime, not just when you're bound at school age. It's not just the transition into your first work experiences, it's everything you do afterwards is impacted by being home educated. Also, I wanted to cover a mix of experiences. So some had been in school, some hadn't. Some had been home educated their whole life, some had been to university, some hadn't, and there was a wide range of jobs and careers in different industries. So in terms of giving you a screenshot of, or a snapshot of what people who were home educated went into, this is kind of a good overview.
Yeah,
to
wow.
kind of pick up on the color scheme here.
Ooh, yeah.
The yellow highlighting was the jobs they hated the most, that they had the most horrible experiences in. One participant that was in sales in particular, I mean, like kind of cold calling on the phone sales. She would say, you know, I'd go home in my lunch break and just sit and cry in the shower because it was horrific. It went against every value she had to kind of upsell and missell things and say things are at a higher cost than they actually are. And these were people with disabilities and things like that she was having to speak to, and she couldn't cope with it. The ones in the burgundy color are the ones that came up most frequently. These are the jobs that they really enjoyed doing and felt aligned with who they were as people from being home educated and the kind of dispositions they had. And then, yeah, the gray is just the range of jobs. And some people had multiple jobs, so they worked through several of these, while some went straight into research or social work, which I think is important as well, that they didn't necessarily stay in one industry or one job.
Yeah.
So just really to talk about the main findings, I think, was the most central thing to get out of this presentation, because as you say, the PhD is a very long document, and I'd really just want people to know the most important parts.
Yeah.
So arguably the significance of home education was one of the main themes of the data, because to come back to that challenging question of how relevant is it to people decades later, every single respondent strongly remembered being home educated. And when they would talk to me, they were self-consciously home educated. They would say things like, oh, when I was home educated, I did this. And this experience when I was home educated led me to want to do this for my career. When I was in
their
this
identity.
Yeah, it was. They couldn't separate it from who they were. And that was key to the research question, really. They did care, they did remember, and it did make an impact in what they did. Also, when they were choosing their careers. So those that had negative experiences quite quickly realized that it was because they were reminded of school, and they didn't want to work in a mainstream kind of environment that was structured or reproduced around school. On the other spectrum, at the end of the spectrum, was those who were like, actually, you know, being an entrepreneur is amazing, because, you know, when I was home educated, I spoke to an entrepreneur and he spent this time with me talking to me about doing this and how I could use this skill and that was great. So this was a really important finding, that being home educated stays with these people even at the age of 55. It's still an important part of their identity. This is just an example of one of the participants, Naomi, who she was home educated for 12 years and opened her own dance school. And this is what she had to say about this topic. Kind of to summarize it, she felt that if she'd stayed on this conventional path going through school, she would have had good grades, got an okay job, but she wouldn't have met the people or had the experiences that she had that really brought her soul and whatnot to life and her identity. When she was comparing to her friends who had been to school, she felt that she'd have a very different life now. And so every decision she kind of had since being home educated, she felt was part of this lifestyle of home education. And that came out a lot, that home education is a lifestyle, it's a way of life. And that's why it stays with you, because it's not just an alternative way of educating your child that ends when you're 16.
It's a whole life thing.
Mm.
And often people sometimes will try and ask, do you think your children would have been better off being in school? And even my own children sometimes have said maybe they should have gone to school. And the
Mhm.
problem is it's not like I don't know if you've watched the film Sliding Doors, where you see two alternative ways this person's life could have gone, if
Yeah.
she'd managed to catch the train or not catch the train.
Yeah.
Basically, the
Mhm.
path her life would have taken. We don't have that opportunity to compare. And your hope is that your children will see the benefit and see that how it's impacted the way they think and the way they look at life, and see the value in that, because you are really taking it on trust and faith as a parent when you set out on this
Yes.
path, because you can't have a do-over.
No.
But in the same vein, you can't have a do-over of school if it went badly.
Yeah.
And if you have been damaged or traumatized by your school experience, that stays with you for the whole of your life as well.
It does.
So it's like, well, which sliding door would you rather have? The mentally well one, or not?
Yes.
But anyway, it's lovely to read these sorts of where this young person is reflecting, and to see that they've taken that away from it. They've realized, that benefit.
I agree. I think it was the best part of doing this was hearing the stories, because it brought it to life in a way that you can't really articulate yourself, because
Yeah,
this is other people saying it. It's not just me, my experience. It's a whole host of experiences.
yeah,
So yeah, the one of the other key themes that came out was this idea of haunting that I mentioned at the beginning. So it predominantly emerged in a negative way when the respondents kind of said, transitioning to employment was hard because they thought of these past experiences or their imaginations of what school would have been like. To some extent, being haunted by the ghost of school also became too much. So, in that kind of first category, it was a bad experience, but they could cope. They found ways to deal with what they were experiencing. In the second category, it was, I can't do this. I can't put myself through this. I need to find a different type of work or a different industry, something that aligns with my identity and who I am. In that kind of third category about being haunted positively, this is where they either saw through the system and worked out how to game the system to get what they needed out of it from having been on the outside, or it was that actually this job is so much like my experiences of being home educated that this is really where I belong and this is what I want to do. So to give some examples of how this played out in the data, so 56, not 55. Yes, so Tom was a great example, and I'm going to come back to him in a little while as well. So he was talking about when he was working in like a betting office or in factory work, he would see how it was just a reproduction of school. And I loved his quotes because he didn't hold back at all. So as he's saying here, you have this environment in school. It's 6 hours a day. You might have a 2-hour lesson. You've finished your work in 45 minutes, but you can't do anything else. You can't leave. You can't go to the toilet. You can't take a walk. You can't talk to anyone else because you're going to be told off. That's not how the game works in the classroom. And then when you get to work, he was seeing this all over again. Like when you have a form teacher and a head teacher, you've got the team leader and the line manager. And as he says, the problem is when you get to work, it starts all over again. You think you've left it behind, but you haven't. And so he hated that. Again, he couldn't work in these environments. And I'm going to show you what he went on to do in a minute.
yeah. Well, I wanted to also say that there's this idea that just like a parent packs their briefcase and heads off to work and goes for this number of hours and sits at a desk, there's
Yeah.
this idea that children should be doing the same
Yeah.
almost. But it's so counter to what a child should be doing at that age, and that is why
Yeah.
it's affecting children so negatively, because they aren't adults. They aren't meant to be sort of in work,
Yeah,
at
no,
that age. And it's this idea that learning should be unpleasant and uncomfortable, and if it's not, then you're not learning anything. It's just very
it's
odd,
crazy.
very
Yeah,
odd.
that's it. There's a lot in the literature about how school tries to just prepare you for work instead of preparing you, educating you. And there's a difference. It's preparation
Yeah,
for work rather than
a whole life
learning.
education, a full and
Yeah,
fully engaged, where the child is fully with their lights on, engaging with the world.
yeah,
Yeah,
it's different. So I don't understand how some people see the
yeah,
other side of that, but
yeah. But we are seeing the impact on children.
we are,
Definitely,
yeah.
I think even the increase that we're seeing in children being needing EHCPs is part of that being. They're trying to force them into a mold that they were never designed for, and so they're having to kind of
Mhm.
try and put scaffolding in place to help them stay in
Yeah,
that system. And it's a system that's inherently not designed for children, really.
no.
Yeah,
It's the same even as adults. We don't
yeah,
all do the same thing or have the same interests or
yeah,
all learn the same way,
yeah,
but the system's just a bit broken, I think.
yeah. But we digress.
Yes. um, so yeah, haunting is too much. So Pete was a good example of this because he started a degree in mathematics, but decided he didn't need a qualification to prove his worth because he could teach mathematics to the home education community without having a qualification. And this is where the idea of capital came in because he said to me, people in the home education community and the parents, they put their faith in the fact that I was home educated. I can do this. I don't need the piece of paper to prove that I can teach their children mathematics. So he just decided to leave the system and set up his own business and has been doing maths tutoring since. And that was somewhat common. So, such as earlier with Naomi, who did her dance school, they just felt that being outside the system as an entrepreneur worked far better for them, and they had those skills from being home educated.
Yeah, yeah. My husband always used to say that you raise your children so that they don't work for anybody;
Yes,
they work for themselves.
that's a good tip.
Yeah,
um, so yeah, coming back to Tom, as I said I would do, this is a good example of how even one participant moved between these categories because Tom also experienced haunting as positive later in his work trajectory when he started to home educate his daughter because he felt that that was a full-time job, but a job that he loved doing because he would remember what home education gave to him that he could then instill in his daughter and give her those experiences that he had in the hope that she took that on board and could see the kind of experience and the positives that could come out of that. So he was super energetic and, wanted people to see the value in that, that even if you are home educated and experience negative work environments, that you can change your trajectory and do something that's more positive, but also wanted to advocate for home education because he went full circle with it. So that's just a really nice quote that I think
yeah.
people should see.
And along those lines, I do love the way home education transforms the parents themselves.
Yeah.
It helps them actually just connect into something that they'd never expected
Yeah.
and become so passionate and excited about what they're doing for their children as well.
I agree. It's a really nice bond, I think, that is
Yeah,
formed. And it's a different bond for a
yeah,
parent and a child that so many people don't get the opportunity for because they
yeah.
put the child into the school system.
Well, to digress again, I actually believe that home education closes the generation gap. There is no generation gap in
No, yeah,
between home educating parents and their children. This is you don't see it immediately; it comes after a few years, but it's something that you see in the children, where the children relate differently to adults as well,
they
uh,
do.
because of having been in that environment. It just it's yeah, it's a beautiful thing to witness.
It is, yeah. that actually did come out a lot as well, where they'd talk about how their friends, etc., were never their own age group really, and
Yeah.
they didn't feel issue in approaching people of any age or any
Yeah.
role. They didn't
Yeah.
see it, they didn't feel it, and it's very beautiful.
Yeah.
So the last theme that I was going to talk about was this idea of othering. So often home educated people are othered in the media as being this marginalized group that's doing something that might be deviant, that isn't the norm. There is a literature around that. It's not always the case, but it takes up a huge sort of space out there. Let's say it that way. So the data showed that there was othering happening in three different ways. There was the othering in the sense of you're home educated, that's a bit weird, by their colleagues and managers, but they also othered themselves as being self-consciously home educated. We are different to you. You're not like us. And they couldn't understand why schooled people weren't like them to some extent. And there was also the othering of the schooled peers, as in, you are very different. Why is that? And it was interesting because quite a few actually tried to make sense of it. They were thinking out loud, is it because our educations are all different from each other because they're individualized? Is it because school does a certain thing to you? And they didn't really arrive at a decision. It was just that they wanted to understand. So when they were being othered, David was an example of this because he would say how with his employers, they would compliment him on the sense of, well, you're different, but you're great at what you do, and that comes out in your work. So as he was saying, like here on the slide, the complaint was how entry-level employees coming straight from school just waited to be told what to do, how to do it, when you should do it. And the compliment was actually with homeschooled people like David, they didn't have that issue. David would just get on with it. He'd know what to do. He wouldn't ask questions, and he'd always deliver what he needed to. Again, that was quite common that
Yeah. And
managers.
I found this bit of your research quite interesting actually. And I don't know if you want to give a quick definition of othering just for anyone who's not come across the term before.
Yeah, so usually othering is seen as when you've got a social group and you're not like that social group. You're seen as different for some
And
reason.
you're like the others. You're not like the others, or you are like
Yeah,
the others. Yeah. That
exactly.
kind of,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. So because I did find that quite interesting, especially where you mentioned about, and you probably are going to go into this, the othering, where they actually sort of almost, the home educated kids almost seeing themselves as like, well, I'm so glad I'm not like those people, like as almost a superiority thing.
Yeah,
Um,
that's coming up.
yeah, yeah, but also the other thing is this thing of, where we spoke about the generation gap a minute ago, is that would also come into this where your managers, you come in there and you're able to relate to them, you're able to speak honestly and frankly and show
Yeah.
initiative, there's things that in terms of how you're relating to them that can be seen as a positive. It isn't always seen as a positive, but depending on how open-minded your employers are, and how innovative and creative thinking they are, that can be
Yeah,
received well.
absolutely. I do remember, I don't know the participant by name, but I remember one of them was saying when she was at university, she got into a spot of bother because she didn't see lecturers as being this separate thing, like higher up the chain. So she'd go and talk to them for hours on end about whatever. But some of her peers thought she just was attracted to the lecturer, and that's what she was doing. She was trying to
Oh
just
dear.
climb the system. And she said it wasn't at all. Like she loved talking about whatever her topic was because
Yeah.
it was a like-minded person.
Yes.
So
And they can speak better to the adults in some way because there's a match in terms of passion and interest.
yeah,
Because I've found that with my children when they went into college, they often felt they had more to talk to the tutors about than their peers.
exactly.
Yeah.
That was quite common across the board, I think.
Yeah.
So another example of being othered in a different way. So David's was positive. The managers were very much, you're different, but that's great. For Arthur, he was a trainee vicar, and he was very disheartened when he was telling me this, because he wanted to go into that profession because he felt the church was for marginalized people who might not fit in other parts of society, who could go and get help and support and so on. But when he was going through the interview process to become the trainee vicar, they were just very negative towards his home education and said, actually, I'm not sure you can be a vicar because you were home educated. And so they suggested to him that he takes this 10-week educational course to prove that his education is good enough.
Yeah, and we do see that. I've heard politicians, and I was in a talk once about T levels at college, and I may asked a question about home educated children. They said, "Oh well, we're not sure home educated children would be up to the rigor, because they might not have the discipline." And of course, any home educator will laugh at the
Yes.
whole concept of a home educated child not having any self discipline or being self directed or anything, because it's really quite the opposite.
It is, absolutely. I did learn through doing this research that some colleges are quite receptive and they have home education sort of pathways, but others are just not. And it's the same with employers. I mean,
Yeah.
I remember when I was going through placement interviews, and the one I ultimately went to, when I got down there, she said to me, "Oh, do you have like your certificates and that?" I said, "Yeah." She's like, "Oh, I'm surprised you had any to bring. When I saw you were home educated, I was unsure what you were going to bring." And maybe that's out of curiosity, but it comes across as demeaning.
Yeah, well, one of the things I've actually wrote it down to bring up at some point is that, to me, if when people ask me what are the disadvantages of home education, I I see the main and biggest disadvantage is actually the discrimination and prejudice that you face from others. Not
You do.
it's nothing to do with home education itself.
Yes, I would
Um,
agree.
because almost all the problems that home educators face, whether it's socialization, sort of social opportunities or groups or accepted into college or anything, almost all of them is because someone somewhere is discriminating or holding a prejudice towards
Yeah,
you, and putting a ceiling or putting a barrier in place there.
absolutely. I would
Yeah,
fully support that view. I've experienced it myself,
yeah, yeah,
and I've seen it through the participants as well. And it's
yeah,
not nice because we see the value on this side,
yes.
but they don't on the other side.
Yeah, because it's absolutely, and actually, I had discussed with Joe Merritt, and I think they are doing
Yeah.
this, that I had said to her that because I think Exeter are now doing this, where I suggested that a university do a trial where they take home educated kids, basically no questions asked. They
Yeah.
accept them on and actually then use that as a study to see how they do. So they don't even look at qualifications, just offer, if they apply, give them the place, and then see actually what happens, um, even if they don't have all the qualifications. Because I think that they, I, I, I just think we've got it so wrong,
We have. Yeah.
in understanding what these kids are capable of and how they know to learn, how they are able to learn, and yes, you can hear I've got very strong feelings about these things, but it is purely just because people don't actually understand uh,
Yeah.
what home education is. But fortunately, a lot of young people are getting out there and changing perceptions
They are.
wherever they
Yeah.
go. So that's positive.
No, I would agree. And it's good to see it. Yeah. I think, yeah. So I think this is more in line with what you were saying before, where they started to judge their schooled peers. Now, these quotes are the more tame ones. There was some in the thesis where they were very much like, in the workplace, all these people want to do is, party, sleep around, this kind of thing. I don't understand why. This is what the participants were saying. because they didn't come from that kind of culture. They'd kind of avoided that culture through not being in school. But some of the other ways that kind of came out, so as Sylvia is saying, she just noticed a difference, that the average kind of person she encountered at work was different to those that she'd encountered during home education. And as I said earlier, she was kind of trying to work out why that might be. And she'd rested on the fact that we all have very different types of educations if we're home educated. It's not, there are commonalities, but on the large part, it's unique to the child.
Well, it's got a lot to do with autonomy and agency of the
Yes, it
child, which
does.
they don't have in school.
No, they don't.
Yeah.
Being free to think and question. And then, yeah, so Joan also said about how in a specific context, such as being in a meeting, she might have what she thinks is a brilliant idea and can see the merit in it, but she gets looked at funny and gets this impression of, well, you're an intrusion, we don't need that idea. You're the home educated one, you're weird, let's not listen to you. And for her, the opposite of that is that they have the blinkers on because they don't see the merit in her background. And so there was many different ways that othering of schooled people came out in the data. And I think that's very reflective of the education these people would have had from their own unique perspectives.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, then there was this idea of othering of themselves. So I remember having extensive conversations with my supervisors about what made it into the thesis on this topic, because when I present this particular part of the data to people who have been to school, they get very offended because they don't see it. Whereas for people who are home educated, they do see it. But again, this was a bit of a different take because in othering themselves, in Lola's example, she was talking about how she was home educated and was hired for being home educated by an employer who really only hired home educated people because he saw the merit in their backgrounds and the way they think, the way they worked, their work ethics. So there was a degree of conversation around, well, if you're othering yourselves to that extent and you're not letting schooled people in, then that's a bit problematic. But that's up for argument, I guess.
Yeah. Well, that goes to work ethic. And I think that one of the
Yes.
things we find is that by the nature of home education, they generally, and it is a generalization, kids having to take responsibility for their own education. So they have to have a good work ethic. They have to apply themselves. And I've got my son sitting, you can't see him, but he's just sitting here near me. And he's 18, he's preparing for A levels. And he gets up in the morning and he's working on his A levels from when he gets up till he goes to bed very late at night. And I don't have to tell him to study at all. I have to actually tell him to take a break because he's really committed to getting his qualifications. But I won't say all of my children are like that, but they've had to kind of be part of those decisions. They've had to steer their own direction because it is about them. It's not about the parent.
Yeah, they often have good moral compasses for that reason because they have to have that sense of direction.
Yeah.
It's interesting. So yeah, just to finish on this slide, Aurora was a bit more general in her comment, but she wanted to express about how she's actively proud in the workplace of the things that make her different, and she wishes more home educated people did that as well. That was the context to that quote, because she felt it was something to be proud of, to value, and to make other people aware of that actually, yes, I'm home educated, I'm different, but that makes me who I am. I think as you picked up before, Juliet, that for others, it was a bit more like, yes, I'm superior, I'm the best. But that was a bit more of like the odd people. And I want to say that I think my interpretation is that was more of a personality trait than firmly believing you are superior because you are home educated. a lot of it came out the way Aurora said it, that we should be proud of who we are
Yes.
because of this difference.
Yeah.
And not try to hide it.
Exactly. And I'm a big fan of that. I run a conference every year, the Learn Free conference for home educating parents. And my strap line is about being bold and free.
Yeah.
That we should be free in how we educate because we're not in fear about it. We shouldn't be educating our children a certain way because we fear the local authority, or we fear what other people are going to say, or we fear comparison. We should be free because actually the most benefit of home education, the biggest benefit comes from having that freedom, and but also
Absolutely.
being able to be bold about it and unashamed, because it does have really good benefits for young people. So I'm very much, yes, be proud of it. And because it's being the PR, the public relations on home education does need us to shout out the benefits and
Absolutely.
let people see that. Do you have any more slides there? You were saying something about being.
Just the conclusions,
Okay, there we
really.
go. Yeah.
Yeah. So just to kind of summarize the research and the main findings, that people who are home educated do perceive there to be this interrelationship between home education and their experiences of work and employment. They can't separate the two. As I've been saying, it's bound up with their identity and their senses of self. And that stayed the same over the trajectories. Even those that had bad experiences of home education, I think there was one or two, they still felt that that experience still impacted work. So whether, again, the work was positive or negative or somewhere in between, home education still shaped that. And how they described feeling as though this idea with othering, that they don't necessarily feel that. They don't agree with what the media might suggest. But there was this tendency to see schooled counterparts as the other instead. And then just to kind of very final line to finish is that central to this research was this idea of complexity and variety in experiences. So yes, these themes kind of helped me to group experiences, but there was this whole spectrum of feelings and emotions towards work. There was minute detail versus people who had had single negative experiences, or the whole trajectory had been negative. Sometimes it was authority, sometimes it was their colleagues, other times it was the space itself that they were in, like not being allowed to leave their desk to go and take a walk or something. There is a whole spectrum in this research of experiences that I just can't possibly convey in one presentation. So yes, that's
Yeah.
where I would
Yes.
end.
Yes, that's fantastic. If you want to stop the screen share, we can just have a little chat maybe about some of it. Thank you so much for sharing that, Rachel, and I'm sure you found it quite enlightening. Hopefully others will as well. And I think that it is important to address and talk about these experiences because, as I said, often children do, or young people experience prejudice and discrimination, um, going into the workplace, going into colleges and universities. And thankfully, we are seeing those changes starting to happen. But it'll only happen properly when people fully recognize home education as equally valid,
Yes,
and not inferior. And I
absolutely.
think what your research has shown that many of these young, if, for most of your participants, it's certainly they regarded it as a better experience, or a better preparation maybe for their lives.
Yeah, I would say so. Like I say, I think there was only one or two that didn't feel that way, but most
Yeah,
of them felt that actually they wouldn't change a thing
yeah,
because they felt more prepared for what they went on to do from
yeah,
having that home education experience.
yeah. And I think one of the reasons you can't as compare, as we said earlier, is that often you don't actually know how the child would have experienced school, but knowing the system as it is, we can actually generally see that the trend is not a particularly good one. This school, the institutionalized education,
Yeah,
particularly in the secondary years where we're seeing a lot of children under extreme stress, and that leading to really poor mental health for a lot of
Mm-hmm.
young people. And my thought is always is I wouldn't want my young people to grow up for years until they're 50, 60, still carrying sort of these negative experiences
Yeah,
from what somebody has said to them, where they've been belittled or demeaned or made to feel thick, stupid. Is that I want my children to be okay. I want them to be able to support themselves. They may not become movie stars or Nobel Peace Prize winners, but you want them to be whole and healthy and happy and
yes,
to be able to support themselves. And that's really what you want. And if we can help to shift people's attitudes towards home education and not be threatened by it, to see it as a
absolutely.
valid option, that actually we can enrich the community. Um, and there are many, many home educated people out there that are enriching their communities in all walks of life, as your research showed.
Yeah, I think that was what was really lovely, that it captured so many different people and so many different experiences that had home education in common but lived complete individual lives, and that's kind of what brought them back together, which I think, like you were saying, is what we need to get out there to change the narrative, to change people's opinions, that actually I think so many people focus on the home education and the socialization that they forget there's outcomes to that at times, which is why I really wanted to do this research, to show what happens next, to show actually, yes, it matters and it shapes them in ways that is unimaginable when you start the process.
Yeah.
But it has these really positive outcomes that other children could benefit from. Maybe not all children, but there are other children out there that would benefit, might be scared to try this, or the parents are scared. They see what's happening in the media, or they've got these negative connotations that actually, if they just did some research and communicated with those in the community, they may see the value in it.
Yes. And there's not only one pathway to success. There's this whole
No,
idea of like the GCSE is like the gold
yes,
standard, which
I
it
don't
is.
have GCSEs, yeah,
Yeah,
and
which
I'm here.
it isn't. It's a lie. And I think we've got too many people putting all their hopes in this piece of paper, which we know is not a guarantee of anything.
No,
There's a reason why the law states that it's the responsibility of the parents to educate the child and not them, because they know that they're not, we could all sue them, take them to court, because they're
mm-hmm.
not, there's too many people being let down by the provision. Uh,
Yeah,
but the other interesting thing that I find is we were talking a bit about work ethic is there's a lot of these like soft skills that
yeah,
are nothing to do with a piece of paper. It is to do with that good work ethic, being responsible, being productive, taking initiative, problem solving, showing up on time, um, communicating well. And these are things
absolutely.
that we are seeing throughout the home educating community that are being developed with young people. I do want to say, just add one thing, is that with the recent increase in home education being a large part due to parents needing to take their children out of school almost to save them because
Yeah,
they are so burnt out, so traumatized, uh, special needs, all of that. What we are seeing is that group, um, where it's not been a philosophical choice, they have to take all their time out for healing.
yes, that's very
So
true.
so it'll take a good 1 to 2 years before one starts to really see all of these other things, the richness of it sort of come into play. And it's a slightly different approach, but through this message getting out, what you're sharing and talking about, we can encourage those parents that it can be a positive choice. It doesn't need to be a negative
Yeah,
one at all.
absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that's important because, as you say, so many of us choose to do it,
Mm.
but those who are forced into it, there can be good experiences and they can benefit the same way. They just need to deal with the trauma of school. And I did have a few participants like that had that, and they came out the other side and then went on to have positive experiences.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's important as
Yeah.
well.
And I think talking about it more means we can be more supportive and encouraging to those families.
For
Um,
sure.
taking that stigma away that
Mm-hmm.
society's kind of put on it. It doesn't. It's not helpful at all. The labeling.
It's
Um,
not.
yeah. Is there anything you want to add now at the end of that, or if have you got any last thoughts?
Not really, just that, I think that this is important research and I would like people to kind of take something away from it.
Yeah.
Whether they are home educating at the moment and wondering what the outcomes are like for people who've already gone through the process, or if, someone watching was home educated themselves and they just want to know there are other people out there that have gone through similar things to them and they take comfort in that. Either or for me is what I think I'd like to get out of this. Yeah.
Well, I will put a link to the research in the video description so that people can go and read it all for themselves. I did get at least to the bits about the othering, and I did find it very, very interesting, and wanted to send that on to those of my young people that I thought would be interested. But
Mm-hmm.
just thank you
Thank you.
so much, Rachel, for the work you've done on this, and it's very much appreciated. We do need lots of research on home education to really uh, respond to the negative narratives about home education. So it's very much
Mm-hmm.
appreciated, and thank you for sharing with us today about the research. We appreciate your time.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.